Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give just another minute before we get started to allow folks to grab their lunch and get join us. So we'll hold for just one moment. All right, we're going to have people continue to join us, but we'll go ahead and get started. We want to make sure that we are respecting lunch hours as well as respecting your time. We know you're busy, and we want to make sure that we are efficient but informative. So, thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Florida's property tax reform and what nonprofits need to know. Um, I am ReGina Newkirk Rucci with the Development Department, and I am joined with my partner in crime, Tom Caron, and we are extremely excited to be with you today. Tom, you want to give some words of welcome?
Hi, everyone. I see quite a few legends out there, so shout out to our legendary classmates from the LJ class of 2024 and a couple of our clients. So it's good to see you all. Thank you for making time this lunch period. Hopefully, we'll answer some of your key questions and any musings, and we can certainly follow up with any specific questions your organization might be facing. We do have the QA function enabled. So if you do have questions throughout the presentations, please use that. Otherwise, all of you should know how to get a hold of ReGina and I by the end of this presentation. All right, so we wanted to start by not assuming anyone had been following the news too closely. So I'm going to do a quick overview, but again, use the Q&A function if you have higher order questions. So the first piece is that Amendment 3 or Proposal 3 would amend the Florida State Constitution that would then require a reduction in homestead properties taxes. And we're going to talk through what that means. And throughout our presentation, we're going to talk about proponents and the opponents of the bill are considering and what they're weighing. So first, you need to know that in order for a constitutional amendment to pass, it requires a super majority of the electors. So 60% of those who vote in November would have to pass an approval of this amendment. That's important because in order to undo this in a future year, you would then again need 60% or more to undo this action because it is a constitutional amendment. Another thing, if you were following the news, this is no longer going to apply to school district levies. So at one point, this was going to be eliminating school revenue. That is now off the table. That will not impact, if this does pass, it will not impact school millages. It also will not impact any commercial, rental, or vacation properties. This is exclusively for those who are using primary residences in Florida and have a homesteaded property. What this proposal would do would limit or remove taxes from the $50,000 cap to 150 starting in January of next year, and then increase that to 250 in January of 2028. That means the value of your property above those thresholds is what would be taxed. Everything below would be no longer would no longer be susceptible to property taxes for your local municipality. Other things to just know that are already part of the Florida Constitution. There is already a Save Our Homes cap, which will not allow for it to increase more than 3% year to year. And it also ensures that the fire, law enforcement, and first responders, any of funding losses or reduction due to this proposal, they are already protected. Municipalities cannot lower their funding levels below 2024, 2025 levels, and those are already baked in to the assumptions based on this ballot measure. Proponents of the bill say that this provides meaningful and permanent relief to Florida homeowners and will hopefully address affordability and displacement of long-term residents. Opponents of the amendment are concerned that local governments are being cut out of crucial services to their community. Would be a state mandate as approved by the voters and would eliminate power from local municipal governments. There's a concern that the relief for these taxes will not reach those who are most impacted by the affordability crisis, and that is renters. Renters would receive no direct tax relief, and this would exclusively help those who are property owners and or primary residence holders in Florida. So that's just some baseline, and we're going to go into some higher levels of impact.
All right. So we really want to make sure that we understand what's being funded currently by property taxes in the state of Florida. And before we talk about that, it's crucial to know that Florida is one of 4 states that does not have a state income tax. So that's important because the revenue base is narrower, and so reductions have a larger percentage that they take, and it's a higher proportional risk, right? Property tax, sorry about that. Property tax is almost, sorry, going through my phone, sorry. Um, so property tax revenue is almost entirely a local revenue tool in the state of Florida. The state doesn't rely on property taxes for its general revenue fund. So even though this is a state issued amendment, the state revenue is not really going to be impacted by that, right? So it's really important to understand that this is going to be cities, counties, and special districts. That matters for nonprofits because this is funding that you may receive from county or city grants. Right? This is the funding that would be impacted by that. The state budget is largely insulated. The local funding relationships is where the risk lives for this. There are also special districts in this, and this doesn't apply to most nonprofits, but it does apply to some. Special districts can fund things from like mosquito control to water management to even fire departments. They also rely on property taxes, and they're often overlooked in these conversations. So, like I said, it doesn't apply to most nonprofits, but some are funded through special district funding. Right. And in Florida, property tax revenue collected by local governments has nearly doubled over the past 7 years, from 32 billion to 60 billion annually. That growth in 7 years has been driven largely by post-pandemic real estate appreciation, particularly in South Florida, the Tampa Bay area, and Central Florida. And that growth has been real and rapid. I think we've all felt that. The cost of housing has skyrocketed. Even my house, I've been in it for 6 years, and my house is nearly double what I paid for it. So that pressure is being felt by Florida residents. So when we talk about proponents of this bill, they say that, hey, with that amount of growth, it's unsustainable and it reflects government budget expansions on the backs of homeowners who didn't choose to see their value rise, right? I had no choice in my property appreciating so rapidly. However, opponents of this bill are also saying that the revenue growth funded real service expansion and post funded real service expansion and post-pandemic recovery. Cutting it now when the cost for services have also risen for inflation creates a structural mismatch. So we can't go back 7 years ago when we still have the cost of today. So that's some considerations we want to have for that. All right. So, how does this likely to impact nonprofits, which is the whole reason we're here today? All right. So, as Tom said, this is not applying to schools. and it's not applying to fire and police, right? However, we are projecting if this bill passes, it would be a reduction of anywhere from 4.6 billion to 8.4 billion. And to put that in perspective, the entire state's Department of Children and Families annual budget is about $4 billion. So we're talking about revenue that's possibly twice that at the local level alone. It's also really important to understand the impact that this is likely to have for rural and small counties where they are disproportionately exposed. So when you have counties like Jefferson or Liberty with a small and largely homestead tax base, they have very limited ability to absorb this kind of loss or find alternative revenue. Whereas big cities like Miami-Dade or even Duval have more diversified fiscal tools. So this is not a consequence that would be applied equally to all counties. Um, Something that I don't think that we talk about a lot in this conversation is the bond rating implications as well. So if Moody's or S&P downgrades a county's credit due to reduced revenue, then the cost of borrowing for infrastructure goes up, which ultimately will cost taxpayers more in the long run, offsetting some of those tax savings. And be just so that we understand that these are projections, they're not guarantees. We don't know how this would go if it were to pass. The actual impact obviously is going to depend on voter approval, how many owners qualify, future real estate market conditions, and how aggressively local governments pursue revenue alternatives. Right? So, people who are in favor of this are saying, hey, governments ought to have to prioritize and be more efficient, just like the rest of us. And the revenue growth enabled spending growth. Uh, by reducing that amount, it will force accountability. However, people who are opposed to the bill are saying that the gap between projected savings and actual savings is not linear. Service cuts often cut more in the long run. Deferred maintenance, increased emergency costs, reduced prevention spending than the upfront savings would suggest. So, things to consider as we go through this.
And Kimberly, I see your question, and we're going to acknowledge that as part of this presentation. So we'll come back to that in a second. So one of the large unknowns, we can start to identify what the fiscal impacts are. So again, the estimate of 4.6 to 8.4 billion in reduced revenue for municipalities. The question is then, where are those cuts going to be realized? And that is an open question. One of the elements of the amendment is defining core services to ensure that those core services, again, that's the quote within the language, will not be impacted by that reduced revenue and therefore the cuts. However, it is not explicitly clear what that is going to be defined as. So they list a few. So the core listed services are public safety, infrastructure, stormwater management, education. What's interesting about those four, those are capital and labor intensive line items for every local government. And so those already compose the bulk of local budgets without this amendment even passing. So when revenue contracts, if we're protecting that element of our budgets, everything that is not understood or recognized as core services is going to be by default the only area where a municipal government could cut expenses. This definition of core services is going to be, if it is passed, will likely be litigated. And so there's some legal ambiguity around core services, also including parks and rec, libraries, planning functions, other community services. So where no one is able to provide a very clear answer is on a municipal or city by city basis, what would be cut? And this is where we now enter whether we define services to youth and education, after school programming, summer camps. Do we define that as a core service, or do we define that as something that could be cut? So this is where, in the case of Jacksonville, the Kids Hope Alliance or the Cultural Council are potentially at risk of having their budgets cut if they are not defined as core services and therefore protected from cuts as a result of the lost tax revenue. So what this is going to come down to is what is permitted and what local governments choose to fund. Until the core services definition is codified in law, either by legal decisions or additional legislation from the state legislature, there's ambiguity between what the local elected officials are going to have to decide can be cut or not cut. Proponents are saying that we, as a populace in each individual city, need to define what those core services are because it creates discipline and transparency so that taxpayers know exactly where their property taxes are going to fund. Skeptics are saying that community well-being it cannot be separated from core services. Mental health, housing stability, food security, workforce development, all of those are integrated or intrinsically connected to public safety, emergency services. And so the boundary between what is a core service and what is a non-core service is a false dichotomy that, especially when it is not defined up front, is going to cause a lot of confusion and pain if this bill passes. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. All right, so this is where the tension lies. If this passes, what are the local government's options? First is to cut all non-core services. The second is to start replacing revenue with other sources of income. And this is where it gets a little tricky in order for a local government to say, okay, well, we're losing property tax revenue, so we're going to increase local sales tax. That is an option. However, in order to do so, there are already laws in place that require that they get permission from the state legislature in order to increase the rate. And it would also likely have to go to a vote for the residents. So it would have to get first permission from the state legislature, and then it would have to be a ballot measure to increase the local property tax. What this could create is a patchwork of different levels across the state where one municipality in this district is charging a higher rate, but if I drive a few miles across the city line to another city, they have a different sales tax rate. So this is a concern that is shared that if they use sales taxes, it's going to be very confusing to visitors and consumers around what is the sales rate, the sales tax rate in any given community. Historically, we have seen it is difficult for local officials to get the permission from the state government and for individuals, voters to actually approve the millage. So there is a lot of concern that the sales tax is not going to be a quick fix in order to make up for the revenue loss if this bill passes or if the amendment passes. So there's the option to create additional taxing districts for specific, again, that would require action by both the state government and local voters to approve it, which would take time. They can increase user fees. So these are the things that you and I pay when we renew our license or when we renew our car registration or parking fees in our local government. If we're driving downtown, and unfortunately I've gotten a few parking tickets. No one really enjoys that. I think people would less enjoy it if the price of the parking ticket also went up dramatically. There was conversation when the governor proposed this originally, there was talk of creating a state trust fund to help local governments with their core services and anticipation of those lost revenue hitting disproportionately some communities over others. However, the structure of that is still very vague. It is not funded. So there is no money already allocated. And if we go back again to that number of 4.6 to 8.4 billion dollars in revenue loss, it is unclear how much of that could be raised any given year across other revenue sources across the state to then be allocated into that trust fund. So one is funding. Two is what is the decision mechanism in order for funds to come out of that trust fund to be allocated to a specific local government need. So the general concern from skeptics is all of these alternatives to raise taxes are politically unachievable, slow to implement, and generally are going to hit lower income households more than higher income households. So the taxes, all of those approaches of taxes or fees are regressive in nature. Proponents are arguing that forcing local governments to be creative and more efficient will ensure that there is more government accountability, more efficiency and equitable diversification of local tax structures. So this is still very unknown. So some of the specifics, who will be funded and who won't, is then going to come down to what choices are made by your local elected officials. And again,
All
feel free
right.
to put, sorry, ReGina, feel free to put more questions in the chat and we can come back if you felt that we need to go a little bit deeper.
All right. So, again, the reason we're here, what's really at risk for nonprofits? So, if you were asking me, because we do have these protected districts and the core services is not really defined, I would tell you number one, libraries, number two, parks, number three, nonprofit funding. So, it is really a question we don't know, and it's going to be determined by each government. They're going to have to find the cut somewhere. And oftentimes, things that are granted or contracts come out of discretionary spending, and discretionary spending is usually the first thing that gets cut. So when we think about that, a lot of things that are included in discretionary spending are social service delivery, workforce development, housing assistance. I don't know if you all are hearing nonprofit, 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 but it's certainly there. Arts, community health programs. Those are the categories that are usually funded by local governments, and therefore nonprofit contracts are really, really vulnerable under a constrained budget. All right. Local government funding also serves as base funding for a lot of nonprofits to allow them to get funding from other places. One of the things that we tell our clients is that no funding ask should be over 30% of your budget, because nobody wants to feel solely responsible for funding you. If you lose local government funding and local government funds 60, 70, 80% of your budget, it's also going to be very hard to find other funders who are going to be willing to step in if they feel like either they'd have to carry the largesse of the weight, therefore carrying the risk, being responsible for whether or not your nonprofit actually is sustainable. And it really usually creates a very large gap for donors to fill. Um, so losing that contract really threatens the funding architecture for a lot of nonprofits and really can cause them to destabilize. All right. Another important part of this is when it's happening, because timing is key. So this is also happening when federal funding reductions have taken place, right? When people have gotten Doge cuts, when contracts have been ended in the middle of contracts. Several of our nonprofit partners in Jacksonville have been on the receiving end of this, right? And so they're facing this convergence of losing federal dollars and potentially local dollars at the same time, which is quite a pressure point and will threaten the stability of several organizations. This is particularly true for organizations who serve low income communities, communities of color, and rural populations, because they tend to be more government contract dependent because of the communities that they serve, and those communities having fewer private philanthropy alternatives flowing to them. All right. So, nonprofit advocacy capacity, really, really, really important right now, right? Organizations with strong relationships with county commissioners, city council members, those local government officials who are making the decisions, and they have the data they have the data to demonstrate their return on public investment, will be better positioned to survive budget prioritization conversations than those that elected officials know nothing about. If I don't know you and I don't know what you do, I can't even argue for you. Whereas those that I've been hearing from regularly for 5 or 10 years, I know exactly the impact that they make. I know the difference they're making in the community, and I have the numbers to show, gives them a much better chance in a budget reduction conversation. The irony of this situation is that some nonprofits will actually likely see an increase in the demand for services, right? If local government is making cuts to direct service delivery, communities still have those needs and they're going to be looking elsewhere, right? So if we're seeing this funding reduction, we are likely to see an increase in demand and need for services. So that is not great math. And it's going to make it really, really tough for nonprofits to be able to deliver to all of the communities that need them if they experience these reductions. So people who are really in favor of this say that nonprofits that rely heavily on government contracts are in effect delivering government services. And if those services are valuable, then the government should deliver them directly. And if they aren't essential, then the market will determine their viability. Whereas people who are opposed are saying that government contracts with nonprofits are almost universally more cost efficient than the direct government service delivery. Cutting nonprofit contracts doesn't eliminate the need, it just transfers it to a more expensive and usually less effective channel. And that includes emergency services. So when we think about all of the things that nonprofit organizations deliver, we tend to do it a lot a lot more efficiently and much more cheaply than the government does. Plus, we have relationships and systems in place that the government doesn't have.
In our recap of this, and for those of you who are already following our newsletter, we have a great resource from our partners at Florida Nonprofit Alliance, which has a graphic overview of what is at stake. So we'll make sure that that is a resource available to you after this webinar. I am the policy wonk. I love the process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is expected over the next few months. So first, if you have not seen, most recently, there was a lawsuit against what the ballot language was proposed to be. State judge has ruled that, in fact, that language was deceptive, and so it has to be rewritten. So there is now a period of time while the administration rewrites the language. It does have an opportunity to be challenged one more time by the proponents of making sure that people understand the consequences of this action, and then it will end up on our ballot. So we, as of today, do not know the exact language that will appear in front of voters in November, because that is still up to debate. Next, local governments are being advised to begin scenario planning as if this is going to pass, because in many cases, the budgets for 2027 are being set this fall. For those of our friends who are joining us from Jacksonville, we are in the middle of budget season. And so the mayor has presented her budget to City Council. City Council is actively working through those line items. And this is not just the case in Jacksonville, across the state. For those who are having these conversations, they're already identifying where might we make up the loss of revenue in the 2027 budget when the next $100,000 of homestead exemption goes into effect in January. So things that we're monitoring and looking out for are Cultural Council, as I already said, Kids Hope Alliance. The other one is the public service grants. Many of our nonprofit partners have been funded through PSG. There is a question to what extent those dollars will be funded even before this amendment goes in front of voters in November. So you may already see impacts in your local government budgets as they scenario plan. So what does that mean for us? That means you should be doing the same. What is the scenario where there is a cut or an outright elimination of government, local government funding? So for those of you who are receiving funds from KHA or Public Service or Cultural Council, I would start understanding that impact and start communicating that impact to your supporters. The importance of that is we are in this window of time between now and November where advocacy is the most important. Nonprofits have to be able to convey the consequences of these cuts, especially as we do not have a timeline for when core services is going to be effectively defined. So we don't know with confidence which nonprofits are serving in an area that will be protected under the core services definition and those who are not. So education is a broad term. Does that include after school programs or not? We don't have the answer of that today, and neither do the elected officials who are having to pass a budget right now. I share the importance of advocacy because for those polls that have come out, when people start to understand the consequences of this, it becomes less likely to pass. So most recently, polling out of UNF showed that there was not enough support to pass the 60% threshold to pass once people understood the impacts of the proposed amendment. So part of our purpose today is to just educate everyone, understand what are the consequences, when some of those consequences might be felt. Some of those consequences may be felt before the November election, and certainly after if it does pass. So we're trying to find a balanced approach here. The sky is not falling, but we all need to be aware. If it does not pass, it does not mean that this worry is over. This does not mean that the pressure is going to disappear. It does mean that the political environment, who is still focusing on how do we find property tax relief for citizens across the state, may likely revisit this proposal in the next budget cycle. So we are getting through this November ballot season. If the amendment does not pass, there may be an attempt to propose a new amendment language that goes in front of voters at a later date. If it does pass, again, we have to define what core services mean, and we have to figure out what is going to be cut at the local level. So the proponents are saying that by proactively communicating this since session finished in April or May, I believe it was the special session for this particular proposal, local governments have been aware of this since the late spring, and they have plenty of time to adjust and plan for these budget cuts as part of their budget planning. Skeptics are saying, even with just a 2-year phase, that is not an adequate enough time to then define what those cuts are going to be, communicate those to the partners who are providing those services, and allow time for those nonprofit social partners to adjust their operations to meet the needs of the community. For this, we'll send 2 additional resources out so that you can see the local coverage. We've got Florida Politics did an article recognizing the UNF poll, and we also have local coverage from News4Jax on hearing some concerns raised by local citizens. So we will share those in our next newsletter for those of you who are already subscribed.
All right. And I am a former teacher, so I love to give homework. So I have a bit of homework for all nonprofit leaders right now. I think these are some crucial things that you need to be doing. And I really want to emphasize doing it with your board. Okay. So the first thing I would recommend is doing a revenue dependency analysis, right? You should really be looking at what percentage of your revenue comes from local government sources. That's contracts, that's grants, that's in kind, that's if you're sharing a building, you're using a facility, anything that is involving local funding, right? And understanding how that's in your revenue mix. And let me tell you now, even though you're sharing it on a regular basis, most boards don't know that number.
Yeah.
So you really want to make sure that your board has an understanding of what the risk is. All right. Then you really want to look at some scenario modeling. So if you were to receive a 25% reduction in local government funding, what would that look like for your organization? 50%, right? If all of it went away, how would you address that? Would you make cuts? Do you have the ability to bring in revenue from other sources? If you do make cuts, what would you cut first? Right? It is not a fun conversation. I want to say that. But it is so much better to have the conversation ahead of time with thoughtfulness and planning as opposed to doing it in the middle of a crisis. I've unfortunately been involved in conversations on both ends, and I can tell you that doing it beforehand is way better than doing it once these changes have been implemented. And if you don't have to use them and it doesn't pass or it doesn't affect your funding, great. But it's a good thing for you to be prepared for it anyway. Um, I'm also going to say that relationship mapping is really important right now, and it may actually be more important than your financial analysis. So, what city council members do you know? What county commissioners do you know? Who on your board has a great relationship? And do they know your organization by name? Do they know the work that you do? Right? Um, this is where you have to be looking through the entirety of your organization to make sure, as Tom was talking about, that you can take advantage of that advocacy, right? I want to be very clear. This isn't about politics, right? It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. This is about surviving in a resource competitive environment. So, really sitting down with your board and just understanding who has connections and who can make the work that you do come to life for those decision makers is crucial. Alongside of that is peer coalition building. Now, for all of us who have been in nonprofits for a long time, we all know that we say that we're all friendly and we smile at our group events, and maybe we've got a partnership or two in place, but actual coalition building isn't something that nonprofits have historically been great about doing. But it's really crucial right now, right? I can go present to city council as my organization, but it is far more impactful if I go along with 20 other organizations and we're presenting data in aggregate, right? If we can talk about the impact we've had on the community, if we can talk about how many jobs we've created, something that I don't think we talk about enough as nonprofits. We do create a lot of jobs in our communities. The cost savings to the county, how much it would cost the county to be doing this, or how much it would cost the city to be doing this work if it weren't for the nonprofits. Those are the kinds of persuasive arguments that you need to be having with these governmental decision makers, and doing them in mass is far more persuasive than just one organization. So, really think about the organizations who align with your work. That could be that they do similar work. That could be that they work in the same communities that you do. That could be that they are part of solving for this big problem that you're working on. However, you can sort of put together this coalition and then talk about that work in aggregate, the better right now. I am also going to say that donor communication is important. And a lot of times we don't want to tell donors what's happening, or we assume they know. And it is critical to get people ready for what might be coming down the road. Donors, foundations, corporate sponsors, all of the funders of your organization need to understand the environment right now, and please do not assume that they already know. Some funders might increase emergency capacity or bridge funding if they understand the policy landscape. They're not going to know unless you tell them. But also keep in mind that this is going to hit everyone. So people are going to be going to those other sources in mass as well. So getting out in front of it, letting folks know to be considering it, puts you in a better position to receive some assistance, additional assistance, if the need should arise. And ultimately, this goes to organizational resiliency. Okay. What you have the ability to withstand. We've already seen this, as we said, with some of the federal cuts that came by, and people weren't expecting them. Is your organization resilient enough to take that hit? This is a crucial board conversation because it's a risk analysis, right? Please make sure you are having this conversation with your board. Your board may have to make decisions and react quickly. And you need to make sure that they have a solid understanding and have planned for this as well. And they know what the organization really can withstand, right? I know we want to put that on the EDs a lot, but it really, really needs to be happening at a board level. All right. So I know we had two questions in the chat. I
Yep.
think that, Tom, you really answered the KHA funding question, but I would say truthfully, we don't know,
Yep.
which in my mind says yes, it's at risk.
Yep.
There's a lot to be ironed out, but that could come down any number of ways.
Yep.
And you should definitely be having a conversation
Yep.
that would say that it is at risk.
Yeah, what I would add as I was thinking more about that question, for those who have secured or actively seeking state appropriations, while those are not named in this conversation yet, if this passes and the state is now stepping in to provide that trust fund, to provide resources down to the local level to cover gaps, that is going to reduce the amount of dollars in the state budget that are available for appropriations. So it may be a trickle up impact where the state is now stepping in to fund those core services as they're more broadly defined at the expense of having discretionary dollars at the state level. So even if you're not funded by government dollars in the state or county level, there is likely to be an impact at the state level as well, although that has not been as explicitly named. And then I love this question from Stephanie, so thank you for
Wait,
asking
wait,
it.
wait, wait, before
Oh,
you leave it. Because I also want to make sure that people are paying attention to what is being cut at the federal level, because I think that would be a good indication of what types of services might be cut at the state level. So, for instance, a lot of after school programs, particularly those dealing with juvenile justice, were cut. So, even as we're talking about KHA, if this is some prevention, youth prevention programs, those have not been funded at the federal level. So, pay attention to what kinds of cuts were made through Doge, what the administration was really looking at, and anticipate that state level cuts, should it go this way that Tom is talking about, might be very similar in structure.
yeah, yeah. Um, so basically, question all government funding, which is what we're telling all of our clients as we build development plans. Is you can still account for them with a degree. They might still exist, but we have to do contingency plans. Um, and now our friend Stephanie, that's a great question. Like, well, what if we don't receive government funding? Like, what else? How does this impact me? What other different measures should you take? So what I love about this question is you still have a role to play as a citizen in Florida, as a resident in understanding how might the other nonprofits that you support, work with, or depend upon in partnership are going to be impacted. So another impact that we're anticipating is that if this passes, core services are funded, but other things that are not defined as core are not funded. There's going to be a gap. All of those organizations are going to be rushing out to try to fill the gap between what was supported by the government and through any of those grants. They're now going out to the same philanthropic pool that you are going out to raise those gap dollars. This is going to put more pressure on the philanthropic entities, corporate individuals, foundations to fund organizations or programs that they care about. what we know definitively that over the last 30 to 40 years of the government at various levels in this country stepping in to uh, offload the government's responsibility to operate these programs, but instead to give grants to nonprofits, which has long been seen to be a more efficient way of leveraging tax dollars for the common good. Changing this overnight in the span of what will have been the federal level Doge cuts, a then reduction of state capacity and local capacity, philanthropy cannot step in to fill the gap that is being left by the retraction of government funds. I'm going to say that again. Philanthropy is not at a capacity to step in to fill the full gap left by the government retraction of funding. And that is verified by multiple sources. So there is going to be less dollars holistically in the pie. And so while ReGina and I and our team at the development department are constantly encouraging a growth and abundant mindset, we also are pragmatists that recognize that it is going to become even more competitive in the philanthropic marketplace when funders now have to make the same choices that elected officials had to make just a few months prior. Are we funding are we funding the food bank? And are we addressing basic relief in our community? Or are we funding a health program? And do we consider the health program to be a basic need or the food bank? Right? These are unfortunately false equivalencies, right? Like health is intrinsically tied to food, food is intrinsically tied to health. But those are the types of decisions grant makers are now going to have to make as opposed to elected officials who have made those cuts. So,
Right. I was gonna say, because corporate budgets aren't like multiplying by 4 or 5 times. Their corporate philanthropy budgets aren't just going to magically increase because the government dollars decrease. That's hugely important. It's going to be probably the same slice of pie that gets divvied up different ways. So number one, I would always encourage organizations to consider other sources, particularly earned income. Are there ways that your organization can earn revenue to help make up for that type of loss? The other thing that I want to pair with this, because it's really important, and again, I said it before, but I don't think that it's getting enough emphasis. If these kinds of cuts are made, particularly if you deal with low income communities, marginalized populations, anyone who's without resources, you're you're likely to see an increase in demand for services. So you're going to have more to do with fewer dollars. And that is also a conversation that you should be having with your board. If we see an uptick of 25% of clients and we have a 30% reduction in funding, how do we do that? And so this is really important in that organizational resiliency conversation. It's a really important conversation to have.
all right, so we always love ending early and giving people time back. So if you've got a question, this is like last opportunity to add one in, but we will start to close this out so you can enjoy the last 10 minutes of your lunch break.
All right. So we are, as I said, Tom and Regina with the development department. We have a variety of fundraising services that we offer for nonprofits. If you need a development plan, you've got some new folks on your team who need some coaching. Hey, we actually need some support in making sure this happens. Love for you to just come in and train our board or our staff. We do all of those things, and we would love to have a conversation with you about how we might be able to support your organization. We also have a newsletter. We have a weekly newsletter. We have lots of interesting topics, as well as, well, let's just say we have a weekly email and we have a monthly newsletter. So things that are happening in the funding world, things to keep your eye on, topics like this, we have that in our newsletter. So We invite you to join the list through this QR code if you are not already on it. You can also reach us. Both of our email addresses are there, as well as all of our social media links. All right. So I don't see any additional questions. I hope that this has been informative for you. And again, we will send those links out to everyone who's in attendance today. Hopefully, you got a minute to digest your food before you go back to work. But we want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming and enjoy your afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.